Hello, everyone. Welcome to our great experiment. I'm very excited about today's conversation. We have a fantastic guest. But before we get to that, I do want to go over a couple things. This being our second conversation we've had, I think there's a couple things I want to remind everyone of. The first of which is it's really important to me as we keep going with these dialogues, and hopefully, as more people get interested in participating and more people are viewing our conversations, it's very important to me that there's a semblance of balance and that everyone feels represented. And so if you find yourself watching, as we continue to put out more conversations, if you find yourself not feeling like your voice is heard, if you know somebody or if you yourself would like to appear, please let me know. Send me an email, leave a comment. You are more than welcome and invited onto this platform. I was even thinking about possibly creating a Google form where people who are interested can, sign up on there, and that lets me know their interest. But the balance of ideologies is very important. I don't want just liberal-minded folks or conservative-minded folks. I want everybody. The second announcement that I want to address before we get into today's guest is Mark Halperin's Presumption of Grace. If you don't know Mark Halperin, he's an excellent journalist. He has a platform called Two Way, and when he's having divisive conversations, he always gives people the presumption of grace. And I expect everyone on this platform to do the exact same. We are likely going to engage in conversations with people that you're going to strongly disagree with. And it's really important that you don't assume the worst of intentions from those people. You don't have to assume the best, but don't assume the worst. Don't name call, and let's keep conversations respectful. But with that out of the way, let's talk about today's guest, who is Stephen Williams. Mr. Stephen Williams was raised in South Dakota. He, while in high school, developed a large appetite for knowledge, which made picking one area of study very difficult when he got to university. So he didn't choose one, he chose two. While at university, he studied physics and mathematics, and he did research on the underpinnings of string theory, an idea which hopes to combine the fundamental forces with Einstein's theory of general relativity and quantum mechanics. Outside the sciences, Stephen is really passionate about history, specifically early 19th century France. And he today serves as an instructor of mathematics and physics. And when he has free time, he enjoys traveling to Korea to visit his fiance. When I tell you that this next guest is a genius, I am not kidding. Here's Stephen Williams. Enjoy. Stephen Williams, it is great to see you. Thank you for coming on and joining me as a guest.
Daniel, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
How are you doing?
Doing well. Go back to school tomorrow, so just kind of planning classes and all that stuff. And of course, it's been a busy week full of things going on in the news as well that we've been dissecting. But besides all that, been doing pretty good.
Yeah, I want to start our conversation today by talking about something that just came out of the news, specifically from South Dakota, uh, a state that both of us are from and spent many years living in. And there's a professor at the University of South Dakota in Vermillion named Michael Hook, who was recently fired in the aftermath of the tragic events from last Wednesday in Utah, where Charlie Kirk was assassinated. This professor put out a tweet talking about how he would give no sympathy to I don't know I don't have the exact tweet in front of me, but he essentially applied that Charlie Kirk was a Nazi and that he would give no sympathy or feel sympathy for that individual. And the reason I bring this up is because I think it's a really important conversation and an interesting one to talk about, given that both of us are interested in devoting our careers to education and teaching. The Board of Regents in South Dakota decided to move forward with terminating Professor Hook. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about this, right? Obviously, we're living in tumultuous times, right? We're
Mhm.
very sensitive subjects, obviously, but it's a really interesting First Amendment question, right? Can the Board of Regents, um, regardless of how heinous, which, mark my words, the tweet that the professor put out was egregious and not the time or place for comments like that, especially with someone who does educate, the youth, the future. But I'm curious, do you think the Board of Regents is doing the right thing there, or, is this a violation of a faculty member's First Amendment rights? Because the University of South Dakota is a public school, right? The Board of Regents, the USD, they get federal and state funding. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a certainly a great question, and I don't know if I have the correct answer necessarily for this question, but it is a very interesting thing to discuss because it seems like we're at a point in time where the right has sort of coalesced around the obviously the murder of Charlie Kirk, which is a detestable incident that occurred over the week, and I think most people. Or I think honestly, everyone should be appalled at what happened, and that we should work towards promoting healthy discussion, which is something that I actually think Charlie Kirk was advocating for in some ways. Now, that's not to say that I agree with what he, was talking about or anything like that, but I do think that Charlie Kirk was a proponent of free speech and of conversing with those who perhaps he doesn't completely agree with. But on the question of whether it is appropriate for say a university professor to be fired over a comment, it seems we're at a place where those on the right, and I'm not going to say everybody, but it does seem like there is a group of people on the right who seem to be very committed to calling out anyone who has spoken negative comments about Charlie Kirk since his unfortunate assassination. And it seems like there is currently, I don't know if you want to call it a witch hunt or a mass attempted persecution of all of these individuals with the aim of getting these people fired from their jobs. So, for example, I've seen on Twitter there's a website going around where they've cataloged 20,000 people or over 20,000 people who have voiced some kind of opinion on the Charlie Kirk assassination that did not conform to right wing sort of orthodox within this sphere. And I have no doubt that most of those comments are egregious, and I do not condone any of those comments at all. But I do get worried when it comes to trying to single people out for specific comments, for trying to find people's employers, and for attempting to get them fired from their job because they expressed an opinion online, especially when it comes to university professors. Because, in my opinion, there is no job more uh, worthy of being protected by, say, speech protections, or say having the ability to say what you want to say than, say, a university professor, because universities are where ideas should be debated and where ideas should be conjured up and then dissected and then perhaps thrown away at the end of the day. But there should still be a safe space to do that. And when a professor has an opinion on something, even if that opinion may not be in the sort of mainstream dialogue, that professor should not necessarily be in fear of losing his position at a university, especially if his comment did not lead to some kind of direct harm to any person, individual, or any crime for that matter. So I do think it's worrying that we're in this space, and I don't want to say there's an easy answer, because I also understand those who say, well, everyone has the First Amendment to say what they want, but the First Amendment does not protect from consequences. And I do agree with that to some extent. But, I do think that there is a certain level of expectation from professors or from academics in general that they are allowed to have an opinion or they are allowed to express certain things without the fear of being shut down or fired or so on and so forth. So, um, where do I stand? I'm fearful for perhaps where this is taking us. Um, but I'm not going to say it's not a super complicated problem because it is extremely complicated. I just don't know that I have the answer for it.
Yeah, and I hesitate to even if these comments were made in a class, it's still a complicated issue. But these comments were made on a personal account,
Mm-hmm.
on a professor's personal time,
Mm-hmm.
and it seems to me that the aftermath of, I mean, this event has really struck a lot of people, including myself, to like core, right? Like during the event and the immediate aftermath, it's had a profound impact on a lot of people. But the aftermath, the reaction from both the political left and the political right, has maybe been really telling of where we are
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that it has become a political football. Uh, Everything from, the political ideology of the suspect in custody, right, to, people justifying, really saying really disgusting things about, well, Mr. Kirk said these things, which therefore, we should feel no empathy for someone who said these
Mm-hmm.
things. And it's totally antithetical to the spirit of the First Amendment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there, Ezra Klein, journalist for the New York Times, put out a piece talking about how Charlie Kirk was practicing politics the right way, in the
Mm-hmm.
sense that he was going on to college campuses and literally giving the opposition a microphone to come and engage in discourse, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that discourse would be spirited and it would, lead to arguments, but it was still how politics should be practiced, right? By talking to each other, by engaging with each other. And some would say that it's disingenuous, right? That it's, but regardless, it's still a form of healthy political discourse. And when we lose that, uh, when we begin to see politics as such a tribal manner that it is okay to inflict harm upon those that we disagree with, it's a scary thought and it's a scary place to be. Um, but I just wanted to start this before I got into any questions about, your personal, beliefs and you personally. I just wanted to start with that because I thought it was important to talk about something that really does affect both of us as people who work in education. Um, Questions of the First Amendment, especially of this magnitude, are only going to continue to impact how people, view their job security and view the purpose of the First Amendment in, say, a college campus, a high school, wherever it is. But I guess to start, I want to ask, like, what's your overall interest in politics?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's changed a lot over time. So I've had quite the interesting political evolution. When I was in perhaps it was the seventh grade, and certainly by the time I got into the eighth grade, I had started to develop some pretty strong conservative beliefs. And at that point, towards the middle or end of your middle school years, it's really difficult to have well thought out political opinions. Oftentimes people say, well, your political opinions come from your parents. In this case, that actually wasn't necessarily the case because my parents were never super political themselves. I don't know honestly where the beliefs came from, other than I spent a considerable amount of time online when I was younger, and perhaps that came about. And so I got pretty involved with politics at an early age, I would say, right around seventh or eighth grade. And then into high school, ninth and 10th grade, certainly was pretty strong into politics then. And then by the time I graduated high school and went to university, my interest in politics and the democratic process sort of started to wane a bit. I started to lose interest. and it's hard telling why. Perhaps it's because I picked up new interests elsewhere that I was more interested in at this time. So entering university, I started to become much more interested in studying mathematics, especially as that was what I went to university to study. And so I just naturally felt I had little time to really devote into studying the current events of the day. And I did try to keep up, but certainly not to the level that I did when I was in high school. And only recently have I started to sort of enter back into the political sphere, not as an activist or anything like that, but simply someone who has an interest in what's going on around the world. And so now my interest in politics has changed from more of a domestic focused interest to now more of an international focus on how does one country's political process affect the rest of the world. That to me is an interesting question, and it tends to lead to fewer debates among myself and my friends, especially considering most of my friends really have little interest in what goes on in France, for example, or what goes on in Russia. There's not as much interest in that as there is in terms of what goes on here in America. And so you kind of naturally weed yourself out of a lot of those hotly contested issues when you say, hey, last week the French government collapsed. The French prime minister, I think this is the fourth prime minister in the last 2 years, was voted out of the parliament with a vote of no confidence. And President Macron has recently announced a new prime minister. And, the situation in France to me is really fascinating. It's curious. At no point in the current republic has a situation like this ever developed. And so for me, I just find interest in it. does do the events occurring in France necessarily have a direct impact on me living in America? Perhaps not. Perhaps they don't have as direct an impact as, say, what the president is doing on a given day, or what my state legislators are doing, or what my local legislators are doing. Perhaps that's much more important to how I live, but they're not as interesting to me as, say, the French government collapsing on a nearly yearly basis, and trying to figure out what's going on with that, and where does that put France in respect to the rest of the world. So where do my kind of political interests lie now? It's mostly in international affairs, because I just find them to be substantially more interesting than American politics, I suppose.
Interesting. So thinking as in both a domestic and an international context, you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of the United States. As an educator, right, you're constantly, dealing with, community, students, what have you. When you think about the future, especially, given your international interests, it's tumultuous times we live in. There are
Certainly.
multiple conflicts throughout the world, a lot of different issues that demand uh, international agreement and international governance.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about the future as a young person, do you think optimistically?
Yeah, it's I don't know. I certainly at this point, I'm not super optimistic about the future as it relates to international cooperation. It seems like the current American president has made international cooperation perhaps a bit more difficult than it's been in the past. And there may be reasons for him to do so, but it is, in my opinion, irrefutable that international cooperation is at a low point now compared to perhaps where it was under the Obama administration, for example. Um, you also see, the largest European war since the Second World War has been ongoing for the last 3 years. You've got, one of the, largest uh, military operations occurring in the Middle East that's been ongoing for the last 2 years, and you've got other, you know, conflicts perhaps on the brink of exploding into even bigger wars or conflicts in, say, India, Pakistan, in, say, the South China Sea or the Korean Peninsula. So, you take a look at where your optimism is for the future of the world, and it's not looking particularly bright, I will say. Now, does that mean we have no room for optimism whatsoever? I don't think so. I think there is room for some optimism. For example, it seems as though cooperation among the European countries seems to be higher than ever, and perhaps that's in response to perceived American aggression or perceived Russian aggression, et cetera. But you do start to see more cooperation amongst, say, European countries, which perhaps is good for them. And I don't think that we would be in a bad position to try to engage in that cooperation as well. But it certainly doesn't seem like that's the way we're going. And um, um, I don't know. It's difficult to tell. And also, you've got, of course, the explosion of artificial intelligence, which is huge in terms of how it's going to shape global outlook for the next, decades to come. And it's hard to tell where that's going to lead us as well. Is that going to lead us into a more prosperous future where we can communicate with each other easier, and things along that line, or is it going to lead to greater competition because now each country wants to secure resources such as rare earth materials and things like that, where they might want to secure them so they can build their own artificial intelligence services that perhaps are better than, say, another country's, right? So it could lead to increased competition that way, which could also lead to further military conflicts. Unfortunately, it's difficult to tell. For me, I would say I'm not so optimistic about the future.
There are obviously moments in time where the spotlight and, public attention towards, foreign policy and international affairs heightens, right? I
Mm,
think of last June, or I guess this past June, right? There, online, there was a lot of chat and worry about the potential for a global war breaking out with Iran, uh,
mm,
and the US's involvement with Israel in that matter. But based on like when you talk to everyday people, how much do you think the common American, and there's no right answer here, but I'm just curious as to
mm.
what you think, how much do you think the common person pays attention to or knows that much about foreign policy or international relations?
From my experience, very little. I think most people could tell you that there's a war going on in Ukraine. I think most people could tell you that there's a war going on in Gaza, but I do not think that most people could tell you where those two locations are on a map, number one. And often that's kind of seen as a gotcha question, like, oh, you can't tell me where that is on the map, which means that you don't care about it. And I don't necessarily think that that's the case. However, I do think that uh, geographical position is important, especially when studying, say, past conflicts or how did we get to this point or where do we go from here. It's important to realize what the geographical landscape is. For example, um, Russia's justification for the invasion of Ukraine is based on NATO expansion. That requires view of a map to realize what does he mean by NATO expansion? Which countries are part of NATO, and where does he view that expansion is going up to? Similarly, in the Middle East, it's really difficult to understand all of the different conflicts that Israel has with Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, the Iranians. Recently Israel just launched a strike into Qatar, which is a U.S. ally. And it's difficult to really understand the implications of these things unless you have a clear grasp on what all of these countries are, like, for example, the history of Qatar, the history of Iran, the history of Israel. If you don't really fully understand the history of all these countries, it's impossible for you to fully appreciate how we've come to where we are right now. And that, I think, most people are, for lack of a better word, clueless on. I genuinely think so. Now, I don't think that you have to be fully clued into the history of these countries to, for example, see when a government is taking things too far. And so I do think that there is a huge push from the general population on ending the war, specifically in Gaza, right? Because recent projections are saying that there's mass starvation in Gaza. There have been for at least the last couple of weeks now. Almost every international government has come out and said that this war needs to end. In fact, there's an international arrest warrant out for the president or the prime minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and that's not, I won't engage in whether there ought to be an arrest warrant out for Benjamin Netanyahu or not, but it's clear that the war needs to end. And from my perspective, it seems clear that Benjamin Netanyahu does not want the war to end. From my perspective, um, and you can maybe understand that without understanding geopolitical affairs, geography, history, or any of that. I think you could probably come to a conclusion on that from lack of that knowledge. And so I do see kind of large gatherings of people protesting in different cities around the world, for the war to end. And I do think that those people probably see what's going on, and they're probably right in that.
Yeah, this is semi-related, but I in my conversation with AJ Schumann, I was talking, we were discussing the the effect that seeing such graphic content has on people, right? This obviously this past Wednesday, millions of people were exposed to a really heinous graphic video, uh, but specifically in relation to Gaza, right? And this has been something that I think has spurred a lot of interest, right? Because of social media. Social media has definitely made following international relations more accessible, right?
Mm,
To people compared to, say, the war on terror, right? Social
mm,
media was not as rampant then as it is now. And so there was much less attention, I think, paid to those issues, at least for common people. But specifically with what's going on in Gaza, for the past couple of years, right? Young people have been constantly exposed to really graphic content, really graphic
mm,
videos
mm.
of famine, of people getting, bombed in Gaza. And I'm curious, I mean, I don't know if this is a question or more, I'm just thinking out loud. Uh, but what, for young people who are constantly online, how do you think that impacts how they see politics, right? If they're constantly being exposed to really graphic content, do you think that desensitizes them to where it's more normalized, or does it make them want to check out? Maybe you can include your personal experience because uh, this content's hard to watch.
Yeah, and I've had a number of my own students ask me, have you seen the video of what happened to Charlie Kirk? Do you want to see the video? I have purposefully avoided the video. I know what happened. It's been described on various occasions exactly what happened, and it just doesn't seem like I necessarily need to see that video in order to fully understand what happened and where we need to go from here. And so I have avoided the video, and I would encourage anyone who hasn't seen the video to do the same thing. I just don't think it's necessary to watch the video. And I think you're right. I do think that it can have some really adverse effects on the human mind seeing things like this. And you talk about the ease at which we can see things going on around the world. This is what happened towards the end of the war in Vietnam, where at the beginning of the war in Vietnam, the American public was very much in support of entering the war and of supporting the war goals in that realm. But with the advent of, say, war journalism and photography and video cameras going out there and capturing things like the Buddhist monks lighting themselves on fire as a protest against the harsh Cambodian president that was supported by the Americans. It does start to change your opinion on some things. And by the end of the war, I would assume most of the American public was probably, if not completely opposed to it, at least ready for it to come to an end. And I think similarly now we start to see photos and videos from Gaza, and we start to see um, you know aid trucks being blown up when people are trying to get food, and you start to see aid trucks being denied entry into Gaza, or people from Gaza being denied an exit out of Gaza into, say, Egypt or Israel. And it really changes your perspective on the events, because when October 7th happened, it was undeniable that Israel had to do something. Of course, it's a lot of people say, that's Israel's version of 9/11. And I think that that's, you know, probably a reasonably accurate way to put it. But you have to ask yourself whether, at this point, seeing what you're seeing on the ground and seeing how people are living, or rather in some most cases not living, or things like that, you have to ask yourself, is this justified? Is this justified because of what happened on October 7th? Is it justified to put 10 million people into poverty and force them to move from their house and all these things? And I would say people are looking at those images and saying it's not justified. We've got to do something about it. In the same sense that people are saying it's not justified to treat the Vietnamese people this way or to treat the Cambodian people this way. So you're right. I mean, video and photography has a huge influence on how people perceive things. How does it influence how I perceive things? Probably in a similar way as it does to most people. You see it and you want it to stop, and so you try to do what you can to make it stop. And unfortunately, I just don't have enough power on my own to stop what's happening in Gaza or what's happening in Ukraine or what's happening around the world. But I would very much like it to at some point.
Yeah, because there really is I think it's a dual concern in terms of individual engagement in the political process. I think there's two concerns here. One is that, no generation, I think, other than the current youth have been exposed at the level of which this generation has been to these things. And so the two concerns from my perspective would be one, well, there's just maybe an urge to disengage, right? Like, why would
Mm,
I expose myself to this if the world is really this scary, right? If current events in the United States, internationally, are really this graphic,
mm,
why would I engage, right? Like, I'm going to take
mm,
a step back. Or the second concern is that it just becomes normalized, right?
mm,
And to a certain extent, I think that's the case, right? Um, I've listened to people talk about, uh, when they were 12, different videos they saw on Twitter, right? During the war on terror, right? Seeing content, very graphic content, and maybe that just desensitizes people to the point where it becomes normalized to see these things, which probably doesn't spell good things for community engagement. But I want to navigate a bit into maybe a less dreary topic and a bit more positive topic, and that's education. So you're a teacher.
mm.
What drew you to education?
So I already hinted at this before in terms of how my interest in politics sort of shifted into an interest in mainly studying mathematics by the time I entered university. But around maybe my late junior or into my senior year of high school, I started to develop a really strong passion for learning and not the process of learning, but genuinely just learning new things. I just found it interesting. I was interested in the way that the world works, and I was interested in the ideas that different writers had that they would write into literature, and I was interested in the ideas that mathematicians had. And so I was just interested in everything. I mean, you couldn't keep me away from a single book on any topic, essentially. And so I think at that point I knew I had to go into academia of some kind, right? I had to go into education. And so I entered university as a mathematics major with the hope of teaching mathematics one day. And that's where I am now. And I'm super happy to be doing it. I couldn't imagine myself doing anything else. But choosing mathematics also wasn't the easiest thing for me either, because I was interested not only in math, but in history. I was interested in literature. Philosophy was a big one. Philosophy was my backup. If I decided not to do mathematics, I thought I would do philosophy. And then physics was something I was thinking about for a while. I ended up getting my minor in physics. Um, and so, I mean, it was very, very difficult for me to narrow down what it was I was going to study at university. And because I was just so interested in learning whatever it is that I could. And that continues to this day. I'm still as interested in learning today as I was back then, if not more. And I think my students see it in my lectures and in our discussions. And I've been able to draw in students who traditionally would not have been so interested in learning something, simply because, I don't know, perhaps they viewed how interested I was in the subject, and they perhaps it rubbed off on them. But I've had this insatiable appetite for knowledge, and I still spend a great deal of time studying outside of my subject matter. So my subject matter is mathematics. That's what I've been trained in. But just as interesting to me is history, French history. Just as interesting to me as like Russian literature, or the German philosophers or anything, right? So anything academic in a way is fascinating to me, and that's what I like to study.
Well, the work you do is, I think, this is a pretty commonly shared belief, but it's true. The work that teachers do is
Hmm.
supremely undervalued, and a good educator, a good instructor, a good professor can literally change an individual's life. I'm
Hmm.
curious, did you have any one educator that really had a profound impact on how you saw?
Sure, yeah, and I've had many to be fair to all of my educators. I've had many great teachers. I had a one truly great chemistry teacher who I took, three of his advanced classes from, and he was such a traditional teacher. He reminded me a lot more of a university professor than he did a high school teacher, and so I learned a lot from his class. And it was in a subject that I didn't think that I would have been as interested in at the time. That then I came out having a huge interest in, and it was chemistry. And then of course I had a high school math teacher who was tremendous and kind of helped build the foundation that I have today, especially in algebra. And so that was good. And then when I got to university, of course, you and I had a professor who I think had a huge influence on me in the way that he talked about things and how open he was about his opinions, which to some people may have been non mainstream, but he was completely open about talking about where he was politically, where he was academically on any issue. And I learned a lot from him, and I've been inspired by him to not care about what other people think necessarily in a way, right? So, it's always important to kind of have your pulse on where modern society is and what acceptable behavior is in society, but it's also important to remain true to yourself, especially with your academic ideals and what you try to study and the opinions that you form. So I think, yeah, those three people I think had a profound impact on me, and I think about them very regularly to this day.
Yeah, education is still, it has been for a very long time, and it's still a very hot button political issue, right? Obviously, everything with the Department of Education that the current administration has worked towards. But then also, specifically dating back 5 years during COVID, we
Mhm.
really saw education become maybe one of, if not the biggest issue of the time, right?
Mhm.
With more parents showing up to school board meetings. There was a lot of controversy over mask mandates and schools opening or closing. But education has continued to stay hot in the political realm. I'm curious if you think that, given as divided as we are, do you think the combination of political division and education as being this hot button issue, has that changed the way the public perceives teachers?
Sure, absolutely. I think that conservatives often look at teachers as well as professors or anybody in academia. And I want to be careful that I'm not generalizing all conservatives, but I see this as a general trend among right ideology, is this idea that teachers or professors are a part of some left wing sort of conspiracy to indoctrinate students under progressive or liberal thought. And I've seen that as kind of a trend with right wing thinking for a while now. And I think especially with the governor of Florida, Ron DeSantis, he's taken a very active step in attempting to regulate school thought and things like that. So I have seen that, and um, where I'm from, our state has adopted new social studies standards based on more conservative lines of thought, which I don't think is completely outrageous in a way. I've read through the standards, and most of them seem fine, but they certainly are driven by this, you know, patriotic love of country, which is fine, but it's very clear that there's sort of an agenda there in a way, right? But it's not confined to just conservatives because progressives do the same thing. And for a while, I thought progressives were actually the worst at this, especially when it comes to enforcing, um, certain beliefs within left wing, ideology, um, within the classroom. And so I have seen that as well. So I've seen it on both sides. And it is concerning because to me, education ought to be as politically neutral as possible. Okay. I say as politically neutral as possible as opposed to completely politically neutral because it's not possible to be completely politically neutral. Everything you do has some political balance to it in the way that people are going to view you. Even me as a math teacher who teaches mathematics, if I fail to meet a student's social emotional learning needs, that might make me viewed as more of a conservative teacher, someone who hasn't developed a full progressive teaching mindset yet, right? So everything that a teacher does is going to be viewed through some political lens. But I do think that, when it comes to educating students, some teachers go into it with a very, very specific goal. They have perhaps goals in which they want their students to develop this ideology that might be shared with the teacher. But then you've also got outside forces like governments, like, for example, the government of Florida or the government of other states that come in and say, well, actually, we're going to mandate that teachers have to teach it this way. And, you don't really get a choice. And in both of those instances, I think that there are challenges, substantial challenges. I think that there are ethical concerns with that first and foremost. And I just think that we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing as educators, which is serving our students and making them prepared as best as possible for the future that comes after high school or university or wherever it is. My goal as a teacher is to prepare my students as much as possible for post-secondary coursework in mathematics and the sciences. That's my chief goal. Of course, I want to ensure that they're doing well as people too, but I became an educator because I'm passionate about my content and about ensuring that students get a good education in it. And that's my only goal as far as I'm concerned. I have no political motivation. I have no desire to be coerced into, giving some kind of political message to my students. However, I do see that that is kind of a trend. Perhaps it's always been a trend. Perhaps politics has always been in the classroom to some degree, but at least for me, I certainly see it as a growing at quite a rapid rate.
Yeah, I think that's an admirable goal, right? I share your thoughts. I don't think it's ever truly possible for an educator to be completely neutral, right? Because we
Mm,
carry our biases with us, right? So we're always going to have different reactions to certain things based on our prior beliefs. But there's a great organization called FIRE, the Foundation for Individual
yes.
Rights and Free Expression, and I know we've talked about this in the past, but uh, it isn't a controversial statement to say that there's definitely an ideological imbalance on college campuses.
Hmm.
Some universities have as high as a 6-to-1 ratio of liberal students to conservative students.
Hmm.
And regardless of the cause of that, there could be multiple causes. It could be that, people who are more progressively minded are just more open to like an environment that is a college campus, whereas conservative minded students might want to go do other things with their lives. Um, but I'm curious how you think that affects, regardless of its cause, whether it's at a high school level, middle school level, university level, wherever. How do you think that affects intellectual learning if you're not being exposed to a reflection of what the country looks like? Because the country as a whole is not 6-to-1, right? We're roughly
Yeah.
balanced 50-50. But
Yeah.
if your education environment where you're learning about, the most important topics throughout history, the most important topics of current events, how do you think that affects the way you see the world if you are only surrounded by, in large part, people who agree with you?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right about that. And I think that students who go to university perhaps do put together a model of the world or a model of their country, which may not be entirely accurate to the demographics of that country. And I think that there are huge concerns with that. Um, Perhaps students will often find that the ideas that they've been exposed to in the university are the only acceptable ideas, and that any idea contrary to those ideas must be not only wrong, but perhaps even harmful. And, it's not always the case to me that that is correct. I think that, and this is how I genuinely feel the political balance in the country, that both conservatives and progressives have the same ultimate goal, in my opinion, which is the betterment of the country. And they both have generally different views on how the country might get better, but they both want the same thing. But what ends up happening is if you're exposed to only, a slice of that total allowable views within the country, or the total views within the country, then you start to get the feeling that those who do not share those views actually do not want what's best for the country, and they would rather, tear the country apart. And I want to be clear that this doesn't only happen at the university, although it is important that it does happen at the university, because we have to be careful about that when we're learning and constructing ideas and things like that. But you might, go to an auto shop, and all of the workers in the auto shop might have a different set of ideas about how the country works. And at that point, they might be in their own echo chamber. And, it's not a collegiate echo chamber, but perhaps a work echo chamber, where everybody at their work believes the same thing. And we should be careful about that as well, because that same thing is going to happen to them, where, their ideology is the only one that will work, and everything else must be detrimental to the country, or people who subscribe to the opposing viewpoints must not want what's best for the country. And I think we're at this point in this country right now where people genuinely believe that. They believe that those who do not share my viewpoints do not want what's best for the country. And that's where you start seeing things like, well, the assassination of Charlie Kirk, for example, the assassination of the Minnesota lawmakers, or the attempted assassination of the former president, or, the list goes on in terms of all of these politically motivated crimes that we're seeing. And, how do you turn the rhetoric down, or how do you get back to a place where we all view each other as Americans who want what's best for America? I don't know. It's very, very difficult. It's very reminiscent of antebellum America in the mid 19th century, where people are doing the same thing. They're viewing each other with a lot of hostility. They view the other side as not wanting what's best for America, but rather, wanting to tear America apart. And we're seeing that today. And it's difficult to say, how do we stop it? How do we fix the polarization of campus viewpoints? I don't know. Is it even a problem, number one, that there is such a polarization, as you alluded to before? Perhaps there are organic reasons for why most of collegiate students happen to have one set of viewpoints. Maybe there is a completely organic reason. Maybe it's a lot of different correlations that come together to say, well, if you are in university, then having progressive viewpoints makes a lot of sense for you to do so. I don't know. It's very difficult, but you're absolutely right that it is something that we need to keep in mind. And I think it does lead to a lot of the polarization we're seeing in the country, especially as it relates to viewing other citizens of the country as not wanting what's best for the country, when that is clearly not the case.
I think I think what you just said is really important, because it's so easy for people to lose sight of the fact that while you might disagree with someone, you still live in the same country.
Mm-hmm.
So your fate is intertwined.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Regardless of your disagreements, you will end up in the same place, because you share the same country, you share the same federal government making the laws that affect both of you equally, right? And so I think it's always important when people are having, discourse where you end up disagreeing. It's always important to keep that in the back of your mind, that you're both going to the same place. You might as well try to work together while going there.
Hmm.
On one final note on education, I know you teach mathematics. I don't imagine you touch upon too many hot button political issues over the course of a mathematics class, but I'm curious if you think that the way, at all levels of schooling, the way that we teach mathematics, which is so heavily intertwined with critical thinking,
Hmm.
how that can better how people engage in democracy and civil discourse.
One of the questions that gets asked to me on a near weekly, if not daily basis is, when are we going to use this knowledge in our day-to-day lives? Okay, so when am I in the work sphere or on my job? When am I going to use quadratics or when am I going to use the Pythagorean theorem or whatever it is? And my response is always, you won't. Okay, it's very possible you won't use it. um, I see no future in which you, as a an automotive tech, are ever going to have to use the quadratic formula to derive solutions or anything like that. And so, yeah, it's very likely that you're never going to have to use a lot of the things, a lot of the very, very specific formulas and content knowledge from within a mathematics class. It's possible you will never have to use that again in your life. Okay. But that's not the reason we study mathematics. Okay. The reason we study mathematics is to develop a strong logical thinking mindset. So the idea is the quadratic formula is a tool that can help us solve certain problems. But my interest is not if you can memorize the quadratic formula and regurgitate it to me. My interest in your education is whether you can take this tool and apply it to a problem you've never seen before. And if you can do that, then you're set up for the future, not in mathematics, but as a logical thinker. And so you're absolutely right. I think the purpose of a mathematics class and the purpose of studying mathematics in general for most people is not the actual mathematical knowledge that you gain, but rather the process of approaching problems from a logical perspective, figuring out what is it that you know, what is it that you're given, and how can you construct a solution from those pieces. And that to me is very, very important, not just from a mathematical perspective, but even when you consider politicians and in trying to construct solutions to political problems. Oftentimes that requires some logical thinking, analyzing what is it that we know about the world today, or what is it that we know about this problem, and what is the problem itself, and have we tried these solutions before? Do we have another solution that might logically work? And I think about political theorists like Montesquieu or Machiavelli or Locke or Rousseau or any of these guys, and most of them use logical mindsets to uh, deductively try to figure out the best possible political system. And whether or not they achieve the best political system is debatable. I'm sure that they might think that they have, but there's always somebody else that comes up with a different system with different mechanics, but they all are trying to accomplish the same goal with the same tool set, which is logical thinking and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think mathematics is crucial to building an educated society, particularly one that's going to engage in a democratic process. And without mathematical thinking, we're going to be left with students who perhaps have a lot of creative thinking and can think creatively, but perhaps lack that logical step-by-step factual proof-based way of attempting to solve problems.
That's a great answer. I say this with absolute authenticity, Stephen. I think you are a shining example of what an instructor should and could look like, right? And I think maybe our education system and our civil society in general would look a whole lot different if everyone approached intellectual questions in the same manner in which you do.
Just make me king.
King for,
I'm
but I
kidding.
do.
I'm kidding.
I do want to wrap up on one question, and it's a question I think it's important to ask every single guest that comes on here. When you throughout your life, I'm sure you've engaged in your fair share of controversial discussions with people who disagree with you. Um, what do you think is one thing that, maybe it's a tactic you use, but what would you challenge people to do better at to ensure that when we're having conversations with people we disagree with, that people feel respected and heard, not just, as so often is the case with political conversations, you're just waiting for your turn to talk so you can scream at the other person.
Assume the person you're talking to is more knowledgeable on the subject than you are. I think is huge. And I live by that every day. Whenever I talk to somebody about anything, my assumption is that they know more about the topic than I do. And oftentimes that might not even be the case, but it does two things. Number one, it keeps you humble. Okay. So it ensures that you don't think too highly about yourself, that you might not be willing to take their arguments into consideration. And number two, it respects their time that they're taking to debate you on this particular issue. And if you can enter into a conversation with the idea that you are not the most intelligent person in the room and that you might gain something from that conversation, then I think our country will be healthier for it. I think if everybody could do that one thing, that does not mean that you have to cede your argumentative ground to that person because now you've made the decision that they know more than you. That's not what I mean by that. It's more so to say, don't automatically assume that the person you're talking to is unintelligent or has never been exposed to the information you're about to give them or any of that. Okay. Because it's very likely the person you're talking to is very intelligent. And, perhaps it is the case that they don't know as much as you on this particular topic, but they may know more than you on another topic, which might be pertinent to the conversation, which might give them cause to take a different opinion than you. So that's the advice that I would give on that one.
That is a great answer. Um, we could all use a little more humility in our lives, but
Mm.
especially relates to political discourse. But
But of course, with the humility, I also still want to be king. So
yeah,
make sure that happens, please.
yes, we can all be the correct knowers of political knowledge with our own heads, but outwardly we must act with some humility.
Of course.
Um, as always, if you are watching this, I encourage you to engage in this conversation. You know, leave a comment. You know, you're more than welcome to come on as a guest and continue this conversation. But with always, do it with a presumption of grace towards our guests. It's very likely that over the course of this conversation, something was said that you disagree with. Do not assume the worst in people you disagree with. Give them a presumption of grace. Stephen, thank you so much for coming on.
Daniel, thanks for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.